Welcome back. This is part 2 of the Bio 6 Muscles lecture. So in part 1 of this muscles lecture, you learned quite a few details about skeletal muscle contraction, and one of the things that you learned out of it was that skeletal muscle cells use a lot of ATP when they contract, right? Each myosin head uses many ATPs as it does its power stroke to contract the sarcomere, and there are lots of myosin heads on each myosin protein filament and lots of myosin protein filaments in each sarcomere and many sarcomeres inside each skeletal muscle cell. So the point is, yeah, when muscle cells contract, they use a lot of ATP. So I want to now talk a little bit about the ATP that muscle cells use for their contraction. We talked about ATP in a couple of previous lectures. Oh, yeah, so let me just show you the animation here. There we go. Yes, the point is just that, yeah, when muscle cells contract, each muscle cell uses a lot of ATP. Anyhow, in previous lectures, we talked quite a bit about ATP. So I'm not going to fully review everything we talked about it before. You might want to review some of those lectures where we talked about ATP. For instance, the lecture on cellular metabolism, cellular respiration, covers a lot about it. In any event, ATP is a high energy molecule, and it is the molecule that provides energy to the proteins inside your cells that need energy to do their functions. The best example in the context of this lecture on muscles are the myosin heads. They need ATP energy to do their power stroke to slide the actins inward. Each ATP molecule has 3 phosphate ions as kind of a tail. You can see on it right there. When it has those 3 phosphates, the molecule is full of energy, and I've tried to symbolize that by showing a fully charged up battery. Just like the battery is full of energy, so is ATP. And so, yeah, when proteins inside the cell need energy, like the myosin heads, they grab an ATP molecule. The ATPs are just floating around in the cytoplasm. Anyway, the proteins inside the cell just grab an ATP, and they get the energy out of the ATP molecule by removing the last phosphate. So you can see that phosphate's been removed. And so that releases the energy from the ATP and gives the energy to the protein that needed the energy. So that's fine for the protein, right? But what's left over is adenosine diphosphate, ADP, which with just 2 phosphates on it. And that is now drained of energy. In other words, think of that last phosphate as holding in the energy. So when the protein breaks off that last phosphate to get the energy out, what's left over is adenosine diphosphate, and now, well, all the energy has been let out. And so think of that as sort of a used up dead battery. Okay, so, I just told you a few minutes ago that muscle cells use a lot of ATP when they contract. So you would think that muscle cells just have lots and lots and lots of ATP in their cytoplasm to allow them to contract for long periods of time. But that's actually not the case. Muscle cells only have enough ATP stored inside them for about 6 seconds of contraction. And so what I'm saying is, if there were no way to recharge the ADP back up to ATP, you couldn't contract your muscles for more than 6 seconds, and that's hardly anything, right? I mean, like when you're walking or carrying a backpack or something, you contract your muscles for much longer than 6 seconds. And so what we're going to discuss is, well, how do the muscle cells recharge their ATP supply? Well, okay, so recharging the ATP supply basically means adding that 3rd phosphate back onto the ADP to change it back into ATP. So how do muscle cells do that? Well, they have several methods. One method that muscle cells can recharge the ADP back into ATP is with a molecule called creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is a molecule that's found inside skeletal muscle cells. And what I've tried to show here is creatine phosphate has a phosphate ion as part of its structure. And so creatine phosphate can essentially just add that phosphate to the ADP, making it into ATP, recharging the ATP supply. So I try to show that as this little arrow here. Yeah, so if the muscle cell finds that it's running low on ATP, because that ATP has been used by the myosin heads and converted to ADP, the creatine phosphate can just donate its phosphate to the ADP, making it into ATP, and, well, that recharges the ATP supply for the muscle cell. Before I go on about the creatine phosphate, I just mentioned kind of an interesting tangent. You could buy creatine phosphate as a supplement. Stores that sell like powder protein and other things like health supplements will sell you powdered creatine phosphate. It's supposed to, help you work out by adding more energy to your muscles. Does it actually work? Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert on supplements, but I just thought it was interesting that you can actually buy creatine phosphate in stores. Anyway, so your muscle cells have some creatine phosphate inside so that they can rapidly recharge the ADP back up to ATP. But here's the thing, your muscles only have enough creatine phosphate for recharging the ATP for about 20 seconds worth of contraction. And that's still pretty short, right? I mean, you use your muscles to carry things, like carry your backpack for much more than 20 seconds. So what I'm saying is the creatine phosphate is at best a very short-term way to recharge the ATP. Your muscles need a longer, some system of recharging the ATP that can allow them to contract for much, much more than just 20 seconds or so. So what is that system? How do your skeletal muscle cells constantly recharge the ADP back up to ATP for contractions much longer than 20 seconds? Well, there's actually two ways your muscle cells can do it. And these we talked about in that previous lecture on cellular respiration. The system is basically called cellular respiration, and the basic idea of cellular respiration is cells can get energy out of glucose to recharge the ATP supply. Glucose is this monosaccharide that's found in our blood. Glucose is your blood sugar, and cells take in glucose from the blood and use the energy in glucose sugar to recharge the ATP supply. But you might remember from those lectures on cellular respiration, there's actually two types of cellular respiration. One is called cellular aerobic respiration, and the other is called cellular anaerobic respiration. Both types of cellular respiration use the energy in glucose to recharge the ATP, but there's some differences between cellular aerobic respiration and cellular anaerobic respiration. So let's start with a quick review of cellular aerobic respiration. Here's that diagram we saw before. Muscle cells have ATP inside. It's a high energy molecule. The myosin heads grab the ATP to get energy out of it to power their power stroke, but that leaves the ATP converted to adenosine diphosphate, ADP. And anyway, yeah, so like I was saying, when the muscle cells are doing aerobic respiration, they use the energy in glucose sugar to recharge the ADP back up to ATP. The next slide shows the overall chemical reaction for cellular aerobic respiration. Here it is. When a muscle cell is doing cellular aerobic respiration, for every glucose that goes through cellular aerobic respiration, the muscle cell reacts that glucose with 6 molecules of oxygen, 6 molecules of O2. And the 6 oxygen molecules react with the glucose to break down the glucose into 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. And that reaction, the reaction between the oxygen and the glucose, generates enough energy to recharge 32 ATPs per glucose. Now, a few things to notice about this cellular aerobic respiration process. Notice that oxygen is required. Oxygen is one of the reactants, so this cellular aerobic respiration reaction just can't happen without oxygen. And that's actually what the word aerobic means. Aerobic means oxygen using. Another thing to notice about this reaction, well, actually, it's not written here, but although the chemical reaction for cellular aerobic respiration is usually shown with glucose being the fuel molecule. Glucose is the molecule that reacts with the oxygen. Muscle cells can also use fatty acids instead of glucose. Glucose is their favorite fuel, but fatty acids are a close second. So even though we discuss this equation as taking place with glucose, not infrequently your muscle cells are using fatty acids instead of glucose. Okay, anyway, so your muscle cells can recharge 32 ATPs per glucose when the muscle cells are doing cellular aerobic respiration. And that's actually a pretty large amount of glucose. That's 32 ATPs is a very good yield of glucose. A very good yield of ATPs per glucose. And so for that reason, your muscle cells like to do cellular aerobic respiration. They just get a lot of ATPs per glucose when they're doing cellular aerobic respiration. And so cellular aerobic respiration is sort of the default method that your muscles use for recharging their ATP supply. So when you're like resting on the couch, your muscle cells are using cellular aerobic respiration to recharge their ATP supply. When you're doing very, very light exercise, like just standing around with your friends talking, your muscle cells are recharging their ATP using cellular aerobic respiration. Even when you're doing light exercise or even medium intensity exercise, your muscle cells are using cellular aerobic respiration to recharge the ATP supply. And again, why? Because they get a lot of ATPs per glucose when they do cellular aerobic respiration. Okay, but remember there's that other type of cellular respiration, cellular anaerobic respiration, that the muscle cells can use to recharge their ATPs from the energy in glucose. So when do your muscle cells switch over to anaerobic respiration? And the answer is short bursts of intense exercise. And when I say short bursts, I mean typically when you do an intense bit of exercise, but you do not do it long enough to change your breathing rate. And here's a good example. Imagine you're trying to catch a bus to go home, and as you walk around the corner, you see the bus is just about to leave. The doors are just about to shut, and you really want to catch that bus, and so you just go sprinting down the sidewalk, 10 or 20 yards, saying, "Hey, wait, wait," waving your hands. So that short sprint that you did is probably short enough so it's not going to change your breathing rate. But your muscle cells are not able to use cellular aerobic respiration in that short burst of intense exercise. Why? Well, because you didn't change your breathing rate. So you just have the normal amount of oxygen in your blood, but you're using an above normal amount of ATP, right? Because you're doing this intense bit of sprinting. So if you think about what that means, it means there's not enough oxygen in your blood to support the ATP that you need using aerobic respiration because you haven't changed your breathing rate to a higher rate yet. So for short bursts of intense exercise, like sprinting a short distance for the bus, your muscle cells switch into this different type of cellular respiration called cellular anaerobic respiration. And the advantage of it is the muscle cells don't need oxygen to do cellular anaerobic respiration. Here's the equation for it. When your muscle cells are using cellular anaerobic respiration to recharge their ATP, they still use glucose as the fuel molecule, but what they do is they simply break each glucose molecule down into two molecules of lactic acid. C3H6O3 is lactic acid. And that reaction, breaking the glucose down into two molecules of lactic acid, generates enough energy per glucose to recharge 2 ATPs. So the advantage of your muscle cells doing cellular anaerobic respiration is that they don't need oxygen. The word anaerobic means does not need oxygen. And so that's a big advantage because it allows your muscles to do these quick bursts of intense activity, even if there's not enough oxygen in your blood to make that ATP from aerobic respiration, because you haven't changed your breathing rate. So huge advantage that oxygen is not needed, but it has a huge disadvantage, and you see that right here. It only recharges 2 ATPs per glucose, and that's very little ATPs per glucose. So which do you think your muscle cells would rather do, aerobic or anaerobic respiration? And the answer is your muscle cells would rather do aerobic respiration because they get more ATPs per glucose, right? They get 32 ATPs per glucose if they're doing aerobic respiration. So I sometimes explain this to students like this. If you had one car that got 32 miles per gallon and another car that got 2 miles per gallon, which car would you rather drive? Well, it's a no-brainer. You'd rather drive the 32 mile per gallon car because it makes more efficient use of your gas, right? So, like, same thing. Your muscle cells would much rather do aerobic respiration because they get 32 ATPs per glucose. It's just wasteful of glucose when they're doing anaerobic respiration. And so that's why if you do the exercise for longer than just a few seconds, your body starts making you breathe harder and your heart beat faster. What your body is trying to do by making you breathe harder is to put more oxygen in your blood so you can get back into aerobic respiration and get 32 ATPs per glucose instead of just the 2 ATPs per glucose when your muscle cells are doing anaerobic respiration. Okay, I now want to talk about a related subject, and that is muscle fatigue. And so from experience that if you keep doing an intense exercise, your muscles get tired. For instance, maybe you want to lift up the couch so you can vacuum clean under the couch, and the couch is very heavy, so you grab hold of the couch and you lift it up. And for holding a very heavy object like that, from experience that you could hold it at first, and then your muscles just seem to get tired. You start to lose the ability to hold the couch, as if your muscles were getting weaker, and they start having a burning feeling in them, right? Also, and so eventually you say, "Oh, I can't hold this anymore," and you have to put it back down. Well, that there's a term for your muscles getting tired when you're exercising them, and that is called muscle fatigue. It's the decrease in the muscle's force. In other words, the decrease in the muscle's strength of contraction as you're exercising the muscle. And there are two things that cause the muscle fatigue. That's what we want to talk about in this part of the lecture. What causes your muscles to fatigue as you're exercising? And the two things are depletion of the muscle's glycogen stores and the increase in lactic acid inside the muscle. So here's a muscle. Let's say that this is the muscle you're exercising. Muscle cells store inside themselves glycogen. And remember that glycogen, we talked about this in a previous lecture, glycogen is just a polymer of glucose. And so the muscle cells store glycogen just as a way of having their own personal glucose bank. So they have lots of glucose, to recharge their ATP supply. But so one of the things that causes muscle fatigue is simply that your muscles run out of glycogen. They're using up those glucoses to recharge their ATP supply, and so pretty soon all the glycogen is gone. In other words, you can get muscle fatigue just because your muscles run out of fuel. They run out of glycogen. And the other thing that causes muscle fatigue is lactic acid building up inside the muscle. Now, the lactic acid is what causes that burning feeling when you're using a muscle intensely. I'm sure you've all felt that. If you're holding something heavy for a long time, your muscles start burning, or if you're like walking up several flights of stairs, your leg muscles start burning. The burning sensation is from the lactic acid building up inside your muscles. Now, the lactic acid doesn't actually harm your muscles. It's not going to physically cause any burn damage to your muscles. And interestingly, also, the lactic acid doesn't stop the muscles from contracting or reduce their contraction force. But the lactic acid is uncomfortable. It makes that burning sensation. So in that way, the lactic acid makes you want to stop using the muscle. And so the lactic acid buildup is included as one of the causes of muscle fatigue. Okay, so if you think about it, both these things that cause muscle fatigue, the running out of glycogen and the buildup of the lactic acid, both of these are the results of cellular anaerobic respiration, right? Because when your muscle cells are doing cellular anaerobic respiration has a very low ATP yield per glucose. So when your muscle cells are doing anaerobic, that causes them to burn through their glycogen supply very quickly because they're only getting 2 ATPs per glucose. To make an analogy, I guess I made this analogy before. If you had a car that only got 2 miles per gallon, you would burn through your gasoline supply very, very, very quickly, right? So that's what I'm saying. When your muscle cells are doing cellular anaerobic respiration, you get there we go. They're only getting 2 ATPs per glucose, and so that causes your muscle cells to run out of glycogen very quickly. Also, when your muscle cells are doing cellular anaerobic respiration, that generates lactic acid, right? And so that's yet another way that your muscle cells doing cellular anaerobic respiration tends to make the muscles fatigue. So the important point here, the bottom line here, is that the more anaerobic respiration your muscles are doing, the faster your muscles fatigue. So just keep that in mind. More anaerobic respiration by your muscles equals faster muscle fatigue. Okay, now so far in this lecture on muscles and recharging their ATP supply, I sort of implied that muscles were either using aerobic respiration or they were using anaerobic respiration. And that's not exactly true. It's a little more complicated than that. Muscle cells can actually use, they can and do use a mixture of aerobic and anaerobic respiration simultaneously. In other words, at any time you're using your muscles are doing some aerobic respiration to recharge their ATP, but they're also simultaneously using some anaerobic respiration to also as a method of recharging their ATP. But how much aerobic and how much anaerobic respiration your muscles are using depends on the intensity of the exercise. The less intense the exercise, the less anaerobic and the more aerobic respiration your muscles use. And the more intense the exercise, the more anaerobic and the less aerobic respiration your muscles use. So if you're doing a very, very low intensity exercise, like just reading a book or just sort of sitting around, it's almost all aerobic respiration your muscles are using, very little anaerobic. If you do something slightly more intense, like walking, your muscle cells are still using mostly aerobic respiration, but a little more anaerobic respiration. If you do something a little bit more intense, like jogging at a medium pace, then they're using maybe a 50-50 mixture of aerobic and anaerobic. But if you exercise just as absolutely intense as you can, just sprint as absolutely fast as you can, then your muscle cells are using almost all anaerobic respiration and very little aerobic respiration. And if you think about it, this is consistent with our experience when exercising, in that you tire out more quickly when you're doing an intense exercise, right? Because remember that anaerobic respiration leads to muscle fatigue. We just talked about that. The more anaerobic respiration you do, the faster your muscles run out of glycogen and the more lactic acid builds up the muscles. That leads to muscle fatigue. And so, yeah, you know from experience, if you go out to the track and you just sprint as absolutely fast as you can, you're going to fatigue very quickly. You're just going to have to stop after a few seconds and say, oh, I'm tired out, I can't go any farther. But if you do a less intense exercise where you're doing less anaerobic respiration and more aerobic, like just walking or jogging at medium pace, yeah, you can do that for much longer. You can jog for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or maybe even hours if you're really fit, and you can certainly walk for an hour. So the point here is that how much aerobic and how much anaerobic respiration you're doing depends on the intensity of the exercise, and the higher the intensity of the exercise, the more anaerobic and the less aerobic you're using, and that's why high intensity exercises lead to muscle fatigue faster. Okay, well, so here in this part of the lecture, I've been talking about the intensity of exercise, and I think you know what I mean. Like turning the pages of a book is a very low intensity exercise, and jogging or walking is slightly more intense, and jogging is slightly more intense, and sprinting is more intense than that. But physiologists have developed ways of measuring the intensity of an exercise. They've actually developed a couple ways of measuring the intensity of exercise, and so that's what I want to talk about next. One way in which physiologists measure the intensity of exercise that a person is doing is by finding out when the person is exercising what percent of their VO2 max the person is doing. So what is VO2 max? Well, it stands for how much oxygen, the VO2 means how much oxygen the person is consuming as they're exercising. And the VO2 max is the person's maximum rate of oxygen consumption. So to measure the rate of oxygen consumption, they typically put the person on something they can exercise on, like a stationary bicycle, but they have the person wear a special O2 oxygen measuring mask, so they can see how much exactly oxygen the person is consuming as the person's exercising. And then they tell the person, once they're all wired up with the oxygen sensing mask, they tell the person, exercise just as hard as you can. So the person just pedals that stationary bike for all they're worth. They just go completely as fast as they can. And so then they measure how much oxygen the person is using. Well, you use your maximum amount of oxygen when you're exercising as hard as you can. And so the person's rate of oxygen consumption as they're exercising as hard as they can is the person's VO2 max, their maximum rate of oxygen consumption. And say once they know the person's VO2 max, if the person exercises at a lower intensity, they can say, they can measure the person's oxygen consumption again and say, you're at 80% of your VO2 max, or you're at 30% of your VO2 max. Yeah, so once you establish the athlete's VO2 max, you can gauge their intensity of exercise by what percent of their VO2 max they're consuming in oxygen. So actually, this method I'm describing to you for measuring the person's rate of oxygen consumption, where they have to wear this oxygen measuring mask, is kind of old school. They have more smaller devices to do it now. You can buy a watch-like device, sort of like a Fitbit type thing, that can actually measure your VO2 max. So you put this on your wrist, and then you go out and do your exercise, and the device will say, you are currently exercising at 54% of your VO2 max. And so you can personally find out the intensity of your exercise in terms of your percent of VO2 max if you buy one of these devices. Anyway, so one way of measuring the intensity of exercise is to find out what percent of the person's VO2 max they are doing at any given level of exercise. The other method that they can measure the intensity of a person's exercise is by measuring the amount of lactic acid in the person's blood. So, as we talked about earlier, the higher the intensity of exercise, the more anaerobic respiration the person does, and anaerobic respiration makes lactic acid, which goes into the blood. So the higher the intensity of exercise, the higher the level of lactic acid in the blood. So they can measure this on athletes. And again, they typically do it by putting the person on a stationary bicycle, and they tell them to exercise at various intensities, like low intensity bicycling and medium intensity bicycling and high intensity bicycling. And they take blood samples as the person's exercising. This woman right here, he's taking a blood sample, a drop of blood out of her ear as she's exercising at these different levels. So again, the basic idea here is that the higher the intensity of exercise, the higher the level of lactic acid in the blood. And so they can use the level of lactic acid in the blood to gauge the intensity that the person's exercising. Here's a graph of exactly what I'm talking about. On this graph, this axis right here shows the concentration of lactic acid in the blood, and this axis right here shows the intensity of exercise. It's the speed at which the person is running. And you can see it's just what I was talking about, that the faster the person runs, in other words, the higher the intensity of exercise, the more and more lactic acid they find inside the blood. And so they can use the lactic acid concentration in the blood as a way of gauging the intensity of the person's exercise. Okay, I want to keep talking about exercise for a little while. So exercise is good for you, obviously. Exercise is good for your health. But there are different types of exercise that benefit you in different ways. The two types of exercise I want to talk about are called aerobic exercise and resistance training. Now, aerobic exercise is what you see here. Aerobic exercise is exercise that consists of a sustained activity. And what does that mean? Well, it means you do some activity like jogging or an exercise class or playing soccer. Anything where you keep exercise, you keep moving with little or no rest, for long periods of time. So like you go jogging for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that. And so you're doing the exercise for a sustained activity, for a sustained amount of time, long enough so that you start breathing at a higher, you have increased breathing and an increased heart rate. Aerobic exercise is very good for you. First of all, it increases your endurance, meaning that how long you can do the exercise increases. Maybe you want to start jogging, and when you first start your exercise regime of jogging, maybe you can only run for 5 minutes. If you keep at it, maybe in another month you can run for 10 minutes, and the month after that you can run for 20 minutes. So if you do aerobic exercise, your endurance will increase. And more importantly, your cardiovascular health will increase. Your heart gets stronger, and you are at a lower risk of cardiovascular system problems, like having a heart attack or a stroke. Aerobic exercise does not give you giant, big, bulky muscles. It's good for your endurance and good for your cardiovascular system, but it doesn't make you look like one of these massive bodybuilders. Which actually brings us to the other type of exercise, which is called resistance training. In many ways, resistance training is the opposite of aerobic exercise. So with a resistance training, the exercise consists of intense muscle contractions against a large resistance. In other words, lifting really heavy weights just a few times. Resistance training increases the size of the muscles, so I should mention, well, how does it increase the size of the muscles? Each skeletal muscle cell gets more actin and more myosin inside of it. That's why the person's muscles get bigger. They're not actually gaining any new skeletal muscle cells, but the skeletal muscle cells that they do have get larger because of more actin and more myosin. That's why people who do resistance training have all these big-looking muscle organs like you see here. Doing resistance training increases the muscle size, and it also increases the muscle power, meaning how many pounds you can lift. So if you start a resistance training program, maybe at first you can only lift 30 pounds. After a month or two, maybe you can lift 50 pounds, and after a month or two after that, maybe you can lift 100 pounds. So it increases the power of your muscles, but it does not increase your endurance or your cardiovascular health. In other words, resistance training is not going to lower your risk of a heart attack or a stroke. Okay, well, let me focus a little bit more on skeletal muscle cells again. Up to this point in the lecture, I've been showing only one type of skeletal muscle cell. I've been showing you that pink-colored, long cigar-shaped picture of a skeletal muscle cell whenever I've talked about skeletal muscle cells. Well, as it turns out, there are actually two types of skeletal muscle cells, two categories of skeletal muscle cells, and they are called slow-twitch skeletal muscle cells and fast-twitch skeletal muscle cells. The slow-twitch ones are sometimes called red skeletal muscle cells, and the fast-twitch ones are sometimes called white skeletal muscle cells because those are their colors. Those are their colors. The slow-twitch type is also sometimes called a type 1 skeletal muscle cell, and the fast-twitch type is sometimes called a type 2 skeletal muscle cell. Well, so what's the difference between them? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. The slow twitch ones, when they get a motor signal, they contract a little bit more slowly than the fast twitch ones do. Matter of fact, I think I have that on the cartoon. Here comes a motor signal to both of them. And you can see it right there. Yeah, the slow twitch one contracted a little bit more slowly, and the fast twitch one contracted very quickly. Okay, yeah, so that's the main distinction between the two, how fast they contract when they get a motor signal. Okay, now here's some more facts about them. So, well, I listed there the slow twitch ones. They call them that because they have a slower contraction, and the fast twitch ones, they call them that because they have a faster contraction. The slow twitch ones, yes, they have a slower contraction, but they have higher endurance. That is, those slow twitch muscle cells, when you use them, you can just keep using them because they're very high endurance skeletal muscle cells. But the fast twitch ones, those are opposite. They contract very rapidly, but they have very low endurance. They fatigue very quickly. And the reason is why they have the difference in endurance is the type of cellular aerobic respiration each one specializes in. The slow twitch ones specialize in doing cellular aerobic respiration, and the fast twitch ones specialize in doing cellular anaerobic respiration. And you know from the lecture just a few minutes ago that when a skeletal muscle cell does anaerobic respiration, it tends to fatigue very quickly. Remember, it uses up its glycogen supply very quickly, and it generates lactic acid. So that's why the fast twitch ones have low endurance, because they're using mostly anaerobic respiration. Okay, so what sorts of activities do you use these for? Well, the slow twitch, you use your slow twitch skeletal muscle cells for exercises that require slower and repetitive movements. For example, long distance running. You use your fast twitch skeletal muscle cells when you do a form of exercise that uses very fast contractions, like sprinting or boxers. A boxer tries to throw a punch just as rapidly as possible. Yeah, so any sort of super fast explosive movement of your body, like sprinting or punching, you're using your fast twitch skeletal muscle cells, and any more slower and repetitive motions of your body, like jogging, you're using your slow twitch skeletal muscle fibers. Now, here's something kind of interesting to consider. We all have a mixture of these. In other words, in any given muscle organ, you have some fast twitch skeletal muscle cells and you have some slow twitch skeletal muscle cells. But when you look at people who do various types of exercises, you can see differences in their percentage. A person who is a sprinter, a world-class sprinter, they have a much higher percent of their skeletal muscle cells being the fast twitch type, and a very slower percent of their skeletal muscle cells being the slow twitch type. In this graph, the red bar is the slow twitch skeletal muscle cells, their percentage of slow twitch skeletal muscle cells. And the non-red bar, both the blue and the purple, represents their percentage of the fast twitch skeletal muscle cells. Now, there are actually two subcategories of fast twitch skeletal muscle cells. That's why they have kind of a lavender color and a blue color. But let's not worry about the distinction. Just if it's blue or lavender on this graph, that's their percentage of the fast twitch ones. So yeah, look at people who are sprinters. They have 80% of their skeletal muscle cells are the fast twitch type, and only 20% of their skeletal muscle cells are the slow twitch type, which makes sense. They're sprinters, right? And so we expect them to be using fast twitch skeletal muscle cells for those explosive movements of sprinting. But at the opposite end of the extreme, people who do long distance running, like marathoners, or they say extreme endurance athletes who can run for hundreds of miles, it's almost the exact opposite. Like a marathon runner, if you look at their skeletal muscle cells, they have about 80% of the slow twitch ones and only about 20% of the fast twitch ones. And that makes sense, right? Because a person's running a marathon, they need endurance. They need to be able to run for hour after hour after hour. And so it makes sense that they have the slow twitch type, because that's the type with the high endurance. They don't really need the fast twitch type, the low endurance type. For an average person, they have about an equal mix of the two. So you or I, if we're not, particularly athletic, we have about 50% of our skeletal muscle cells being the slow twitch type, and about 50% of our skeletal muscle cells being the fast twitch type. Which sort of leads to a question. Did these people become sprinters because they were just born with more fast twitch type and very little of the slow twitch type? Or did they get a lot of fast twitch type because they started practicing being sprinters? And likewise, for these marathon runners, did they become marathon runners because they were just naturally born with slow twitch, high endurance muscles? Or did they develop that high percentage of slow twitch skeletal muscles, high endurance ones, after they started training to become a marathon runner? And the answer is a little bit of both. What they find is that people are born with different percentages of fast twitch or slow twitch muscles. In other words, a given person just might be born with 70% fast twitch muscle and 30% slow twitch muscle, and a different person just might be born with 70% fast twitch muscle and 30% slow twitch muscle. So partly your ability to be, a person who can do rapid explosive movements, or a person who has long endurance, part of that is just how you're born, what percentage of fast twitch or slow twitch muscle you're born with. But it's also true, they found, that you can change your percentage by the type of athletic training you do. So if you train for distance endurance exercises, like you train to go running for long periods of time, then you increase your percentage of the slow twitch, high endurance muscles, and therefore you'll have fewer of the fast twitch ones. But on the other hand, if you trained for explosive exercises like sprinting or boxing or martial arts, then you will increase your percentage of the fast twitch muscle types and decrease your percentage of the slow twitch, high endurance types. Yeah, so anyway, your percentage of the fast twitch versus the slow twitch is partially what you're born with, but it's also partially how you train. Okay, so that was about the slow twitch skeletal muscles and the fast twitch skeletal muscles. We want to move on now to a different topic within the muscular system, something called graded contractions. Okay, so the basic concept here is that with your skeletal muscles, you can consciously control how much force your skeletal muscles generate. For example, you could, if you want to hold an egg gently, you could do that, right? Which means that you're having your finger skeletal muscles generate very little force to hold the egg gently. Or, if you wanted to, you could squeeze the egg so hard that it completely breaks, like you see here. And so that would be a hard squeeze. In other words, you're getting your finger muscles to generate a lot of force. So yeah, your muscles, you can make them generate a lot of force or a little force or anything in between. And your ability to have your muscles generate different amounts of force, different amounts of contraction strength, are called graded contractions. A muscle's ability to generate different amounts of force. Well, as it turns out, there are two systems that your skeletal muscles use to cause graded contractions. And one of these two systems that allows your skeletal muscles to do graded contractions is the number of muscle cells within the muscle organ that you cause to contract, and the other is the frequency of the nerve signals that you send to the muscle cells in the muscle organ. So let me go through those two systems of graded contractions one at a time. So the first one is that you can have graded contractions. You can control the amount of force that a muscle generates based on the number of muscle cells inside the muscle organ that you contract. Okay, so here is a cross-section of a skeletal muscle organ, and remember all these little pink circle-like things that you see there are the skeletal muscle cells. They look like little circles because they're being seen in cross-section, but of course each individual skeletal muscle cell is a long cigar-shaped cell. Okay, anyway, so this represents a skeletal muscle organ, and remember that there are these things called motor units that control the contraction of the skeletal muscle cells within the organ. Remember, one motor unit is one motor neuron and all the skeletal muscle cells that motor neuron controls, because motor neurons have several collaterals, each of which can synapse with an individual skeletal muscle cell. All right, and on a skeletal muscle organ, like you see here, there are several motor units controlling its skeletal muscle cells. Now, on this skeletal muscle organ, I'm only showing 3 motor units. That's far too few. A real skeletal muscle organ would have lots more than just 3 motor units controlling its skeletal muscle cells. How many motor units does a typical skeletal muscle organ have? Well, I have no idea, and I'm sure it depends on if it's a large or small skeletal muscle organ. But just to keep this diagram simple, let's just say that 3 motor units control all the skeletal muscle cells within this organ. Okay, so the basic idea here is that the greater number of cells within the muscle organ that contract, the greater the muscle's force that it generates. And that kind of makes sense, right? The larger number of cells that get contraction signals within the muscle organ, the more force the organ's going to generate. So if you want a muscle organ to generate very little force, you only send motor signals to a small number of the cells. In other words, only one or a few motor units are sending signals to the muscle organ. If you want the muscle organ to generate a little bit more force, you activate more of the muscle cells within the organ. In other words, you use more motor units to send signals to the muscle cells. So more of the muscle cells get contraction signals. And if you want the muscle organ to generate its maximum amount of force, you have all of the motor units send motor signals so that all of the skeletal muscle cells get contraction signals. And yeah, that's all there is to this concept, that the greater the number of skeletal muscle cells within the organ that are getting motor signals to contract, the greater the force that the muscle organ generates. Now, obviously you don't consciously choose the exact number of motor units that send motor signals to the muscle. You don't say, hey, I need to pick up that egg gently, so I'm going to only use one motor unit for my finger muscles. But it works like this, that you consciously decide whether you want to have the muscle generate very little force or a medium amount of force or a lot of force. You just sort of think about whether you want the muscle to generate a lot of force or medium force or very little force. And then the primary motor area in your cerebrum, the part of the cerebrum that generates motor signals, then interprets your desire for a strong contraction or a weak contraction, and then it sends the motor signals to the right number of motor units to make the muscle contract to your desired strength of contraction. Okay, so anyway, so this is one system that your muscles have of producing these graded contractions. It comes down to here the different number of skeletal muscle cells within the organ that get contraction signals. The other system that your muscles have to control the amount of force, in other words, the other system that your skeletal muscle organs have to control the amount of force that the organ generates, is the frequency of the motor signals that get sent to the skeletal muscle cells. This is supposed to be a skeletal muscle cell, and here I'm showing one sarcomere inside of it. Now, obviously, skeletal muscle cells have many more than one sarcomere, but just to keep the diagram simple, let's just show one sarcomere. And this is the motor neuron that controls that particular skeletal muscle cell. Okay, so yeah, now we're going to talk about this other system for giving graded contractions, which is the frequency of the motor signals that are sent to the skeletal muscle cell. Okay, so this part of the lecture is, I think, a little bit complicated and potentially confusing. In other words, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how the frequency of nerve signals to the individual skeletal muscle cells controls their strength of contraction. So just so you don't get lost in the details, let me just give you the big picture right away. The faster the frequency of nerve signals that this motor neuron sends to the skeletal muscle cell, the stronger the contraction it makes. And incidentally, when we say the frequency of nerve signals, we mean how many nerve signals this is sending to the cell per second. Frequency is how many times per second. So yeah, the higher frequency of motor nerve signals that it sends to the skeletal muscle cell, the stronger the strength of contraction is going to be. Okay, so that's the big picture. And now let me launch into the details of that concept, but don't get lost in the details. Just don't forget the big picture. Faster frequency of nerve signals equals larger strength of contraction. Okay, but now, let's jump into the details. So, that's supposed to be a motor neuron, and this is supposed to be one skeletal muscle cell, and this is the motor neuron that's controlling that skeletal muscle cell. Okay, so let's say that we want to measure how much the strength of contraction of this particular skeletal muscle cell. Well, here's how we might do it. We might attach a spring to the side of that skeletal muscle cell, and let's say we attach the other end of that spring to something solid like a wall right here. Well, I think you will agree that it takes force to stretch a spring, right? And so as that skeletal muscle cell contracts, the smaller it makes itself, the more it contracts, the more force it's going to be able to apply to stretch that spring. So what I'm saying is we can gauge how much force of contraction this skeletal muscle cell is making by how much it can stretch the spring. If it contracts itself a lot, that's a higher force of contraction, right? Because it can stretch the spring more. But if it contracts itself very little, then that's not going to stretch the spring very far. So we know that that's a low force of contraction. So, again, the concept here is that the smaller this skeletal muscle cell can make itself, the more fully it contracts. That means the more force it's generating. Okay, so imagine we have this sort of experiment set up where we can measure how much force the skeletal muscle cell is generating by how much it stretches the spring. And again, the smaller this makes itself, the smaller the skeletal muscle cell makes itself, the more force it generates. Okay, and let's also imagine we had some sort of computer monitor that is going to graphically show us how much force the muscle cell generates. That'll be shown on the y-axis of this graph versus the frequency of the nerve signals that the motor neuron is sending to the muscle cell right there. Okay, good. So let's start this experiment by having the motor neuron just send one motor signal, just one single motor signal to the skeletal muscle cell. So I guess we're assuming that we can somehow control that motor neuron. We say, okay, motor neuron, send one and only one motor signal to the skeletal muscle cell. Here it goes. Bzz. Okay, so that motor signal did cause the muscle cell to contract, and so it got smaller, and therefore it stretched the spring. And our computer graph showed that there was a small force of contraction. Here we're showing it as a bar graph, for a fairly small force, right? And so yeah, the fact is that just one single motor signal to a skeletal muscle cell does not cause very much contraction force to be generated by that skeletal muscle cell. Why? Because the skeletal muscle cell did not get that much smaller. It hardly contracted. Incidentally, the term for one single for the amount of contraction that the skeletal muscle cell does from one single nerve signal is called a twitch. So yeah, so one twitch means the amount of contraction that the skeletal muscle cell does when it receives just one and only one single motor nerve signal. Okay, now why is it that the skeletal muscle cell did not generate very much force from that one twitch, that one motor signal? Because it didn't contract very much. Remember that the more the skeletal muscle cell contracts, the more force it generates, right? The more it can stretch the spring. And the reason why the skeletal muscle cell did not contract very much is its sarcomeres did not contract very much. The actins did not slide very far inward on the myosins. So the lesson there is that a single twitch does not completely contract the sarcomeres. In fact, a single twitch contracts them very little, and therefore one twitch does not generate very much force from the muscle cell. Okay, so now we're going to change the experiment slightly. Instead of having the motor neuron just send one single twitch, we're going to have it send a series of twitches, a series of motor nerve signals. Okay, we say, okay, motor neuron, send a series of motor signals to the skeletal muscle cell. So here it goes. Bzz, bzz, bzz. So yeah, it's sending a series of motor signals to the skeletal muscle cell, but at a low frequency, meaning that it's sending very few signals per second. Those signals are coming at a low frequency. So what is the skeletal muscle cell going to do in response to receiving very low frequencies of motor signals? Well, it will still contract, but it won't contract too much. And so maybe you can see here, it contracted a little more than when it just got the single motor signal, from the twitch. It contracted more than the twitch, but not that much more. The sarcomeres did not contract that much more, so the skeletal muscle cell did not get that much shorter, and so it generated some force, more force than just the single one, but still not very much force. Okay, so now we'll say, hey, skeletal muscle cell, you can relax, and motor neuron stop sending signals for a moment. So now the skeletal muscle cell relaxes, and now we're going to say, hey, motor neuron, send another series of motor signals to the skeletal muscle cell, but at a little bit higher frequency. Bzz, 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 bzz. So there's a slightly higher frequency of motor signals, and the skeletal muscle cell will now contract a little bit more. It'll make itself a little bit more smaller. You can see the sarcomere, the actin slid in a little bit more deeply over the myosins, so the skeletal muscle cell got a little shorter, which means it generates a little bit more force right there. And we say, okay, motor neuron, stop and let the skeletal muscle cell relax. There we go. And now we say, hey, motor neuron, send motor signals to the cell at an even higher frequency. Bzz, 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 a higher frequency of motor signals. And so now that will make the skeletal muscle cell contract even more deeply. It will make itself even more smaller than before because the frequency of motor signals is higher. You can see that the actin slid even more deeply over the myosins. And so the muscle cell got even shorter, so it generates more force. It's stretching the spring even more. And so we have a higher amount of force being generated because we have a higher frequency of contraction. So I think you're getting the idea. Let's do it one more time. We say, motor neuron, relax for just a second. Stop sending signals for just a second so the cell can relax. And now we say, Mr. Motor Neuron, send an even higher frequency of nerve signals to that skeletal muscle cell. Bzz, 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 bzz. And I think you can guess now, it's going to, the higher frequencies make the sarcomere contract even more deeply. So the skeletal muscle cell contracts to an even smaller size, which generates more force, right? That contracts the spring even more. So we get even more force generated from the skeletal muscle cell. So yeah, that's part of the big picture here. The higher the frequency of nerve signals to a skeletal muscle cell, the greater the force that the skeletal muscle cell generates. So that's part of the graded response. That's part of the ability of your muscle organs to generate different amounts of force is by way of the frequency of the nerve signals that you send to the cells of that skeletal muscle organ. And the higher the frequency, the more force your skeletal muscle organs generate, because the higher the frequency, the smaller the skeletal muscle cells make themselves, because their sarcomeres contract more deeply the higher the frequency. Okay, good. Now, notice something interesting here. If you look at the sarcomere, notice that it's fully contracted. It's contracted far enough that the Z discs, the gray lines there and there, have come and crashed into the myosins, the blue filaments that you see there. And so remember that is the maximum amount of contraction that a sarcomere can do. The actins can only slide inward enough until the Z discs crash into the myosins, and at that point the sarcomere cannot contract any more deeply. That's as small as the sarcomere can get. So since the sarcomeres inside the skeletal muscle cell are now as fully contracted as they can get, that's the maximum amount of force that this skeletal muscle cell can generate, because it generates its force by making itself smaller, right? So let me relax the skeletal muscle cell for a moment. We say, hey, motor neuron, stop sending signals, and so it allows it to relax. Okay, here's a thought question for you. In a moment, I'm going to tell the motor neuron to contract at an even higher frequency, even more than we saw just a second ago. Do you think when I ask this motor neuron to send signals at an even higher frequency, do you think the skeletal muscle cell will be able to generate even more force than it did before? And the answer is no, it won't. We can increase the frequency even higher, but we've already reached the frequency where the sarcomeres are fully contracted, and so they can't make themselves any smaller, so the skeletal muscle cell can't make itself any smaller, and so we've already reached the frequency of its maximum contraction strength. And I'll show you. So we say, hey, Mr. Motor neuron, send an even higher frequency to the skeletal muscle cell. So it goes bzz, 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 highest frequency yet, but it doesn't generate any more force because we've already gone beyond the frequency that gives us maximum sarcomere contraction, which therefore gives us maximum, shortest length of the skeletal muscle cell. And so notice that we are at a higher frequency than before, but we don't have any more contraction force because we're already beyond the frequency that gives us maximum sarcomere contraction. And so let's tell the neuron to stop sending signals, let the muscle cell relax, and just to show that that we've reached the maximum, let's have the motor neuron do an even higher frequency still. It's highest possible frequency of motor signals. Here they are. Are we going to get any more, even greater force of contraction? No, because we're already above the frequency that gives us full sarcomere contraction. So yet again, we're just going to be at our maximum contraction strength, force of contraction, but no greater. So what's the picture here? The big picture, that to a degree, a higher frequency of nerve signals to the muscle cell does give you a higher force of contraction. But at some point, the frequency will be high enough so that the sarcomeres are fully contracted, and therefore the skeletal muscle cell is as short as it can get. And above that point, you can have higher frequencies of nerve signals, but that's not going to give any higher strength of contraction because you've already reached the maximum contraction of the sarcomeres. And there's a name for that state. If the rate of motor signals to the skeletal muscle cell is high enough so that the sarcomeres are fully contracted and it can't generate any force, it's at its maximum force of contraction, we say that the skeletal muscle cell or the skeletal muscle organ is in a state called tetanus. So yeah, tetanus means that the sarcomeres and therefore the entire skeletal muscle cell is fully contracted, and so it's generating the maximum amount of force possible. We call that state tetanus. Now, there's a disease called tetanus, which is a type of bacterial disease. Don't confuse the two. Even though they're both called tetanus, the bacterial disease is pathology. It's a sickness. It's not healthy for you. This kind of tetanus, the maximum amount of muscle contraction, is a normal, healthy part of the functioning of your muscles. It just means that you're contracting the muscle as far as it can, so the muscle is generating its maximum amount of force. Yeah, so this type of tetanus is not the disease. It's part of the normal functioning of muscle organs. Okay, well, so let's let the muscle relax. Just to recap what we just talked about, we talked about things called graded contractions, which is a muscle's ability to generate different amounts of force. A gentle contraction, a medium strength contraction, or a very strong maximum force contraction. And the two systems that your skeletal muscles have for being able to do these graded contractions are how many individual muscle cells within the muscle organ are getting contraction signals, motor nerve signals, and the other is the frequency of those motor signals. The higher the frequency of motor signals that arrive at the cells, the greater the strength of contraction up to a point. But if the frequency goes beyond a certain point, then a higher frequency does not give you a higher strength of contraction, because above a certain frequency, the individual muscle cells are in this state called tetanus, where they have already reached their maximum amount of contraction. Okay, we are almost at the end of this lecture on the muscular system. We're going to finish off by discussing muscle development and some muscle system disorders. In other words, some muscular system diseases. But let's start off with muscular system development. So we all start off as newborn babies, obviously, and newborn babies have all the muscles that they're ever going to have throughout their entire life, and they have all the nerves to control those muscles that they're ever going to have throughout their entire life. So you might wonder, well, if newborn babies have all the muscles and they have all the motor neurons to send signals to those muscles, why can't newborn babies walk and move around and move their arms and legs purposefully the way adults do? Well, the answer is it just simply takes time to learn to control one's voluntary muscles. In other words, it takes time to practice sending the right motor signals to those muscles to use those muscles in a coordinated way. Okay, anyway, so we all start off with small muscles, and we slowly learn to control them. Eventually we grow to our adult size, which means that our muscles get bigger and stronger. But males usually end up with larger and more powerful muscles than females. And obviously that's not always the case, but On average, males have more muscles and larger muscles than females do. And why is that? And the short answer is testosterone, the male hormone. Testosterone causes increased muscle size and increased muscle strength. And since males have more testosterone than females, that's why males end up with bigger and stronger muscles than females do on average. Now, females do have some testosterone. You might remember that the adrenal cortex secretes small amounts of testosterone in both sexes, so that's where females get their testosterone from. But the major source of testosterone is the testes, which only males have, and so males end up with more testosterone than females, and so that's why males end up with larger muscles than females do. Now, sometimes in the news, you might hear of athletes getting caught for taking anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are synthetic testosterone drugs, and athletes take these because it gives them bigger and more powerful muscles, and that gives them an advantage at their sport. This is a picture of a baseball player named Barry Bonds. He started off playing, I think, with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and then at some point he transferred to the San Francisco Giants, and he broke a bunch of records. I'm not sure exactly which records he broke, but he definitely broke some baseball records. But it later on came out that he'd been taking some anabolic steroids, which are banned in baseball and other sports, and so they took away his records. But you can certainly see how much larger his muscles are after he started taking the anabolic steroids. So, why are these anabolic steroids banned if they do give these athletes larger or more powerful muscles? Well, steroids are banned in sports because they're dangerous. Taking anabolic steroids increases the risk of liver cancer, and it also has other possible dangerous health effects. So that's why they're banned. And there's also some evidence that taking anabolic steroids leads to something called roid rage, where people get overly aggressive. They just want to get in fights all the time as one of the effects of taking anabolic steroids. Anyway, because of the dangers of increased liver cancer and other effects and roid rage, anabolic steroids are banned from all sports. Now, another thing I want you to know about muscles is that they naturally will atrophy. They will naturally get smaller and weaker if you're not exercising them. So the lesson there that it's important to have a exercise routine, a daily exercise routine, jogging or weightlifting or some sort of sport to keep your muscles active, because if you're not exercising them, they're just naturally going to get smaller and weaker. It's a real use it or lose it type thing with your muscles. And the fact that muscles naturally will atrophy if you're not using them is why that if a person gets immobilized by some sort of injury, maybe they broke part of their spine and so they have to lay in bed for weeks at a time waiting for it to heal. That's why as soon as the person is able to walk, the doctors and nurses try to get the person to get on their feet and start walking again. And the reason is because when the person's recovering just lying in bed, their muscles are atrophying. So when a patient's in the hospital, as soon as possible, they get the person up and walking around so that the person minimizes the loss of their muscles through atrophy from inactivity. So again, getting back to the point I made a second ago, that with muscles, they are going to get smaller and weaker if you're not using them. So it's important to have some sort of daily exercise routine. Even if you do have a daily exercise routine and you conscientiously stick to it, you're definitely going to have some loss of muscles as you get older. That's just a natural part of aging. But what I'm saying is you may have a certain level of strength when you're in your 20s or 30s, but by the time you start to get to middle age in your senior years, you just have to face it. You're going to lose some strength. You're not going to be as strong as you were in your 20s and 30s. When we age, we get it when we get into middle age in our senior years. what's causing the muscles to get weaker is that we are losing skeletal muscle cells from our muscle organs. In other words, skeletal muscle cells just die off over the course of our life, so our muscles get weaker. Interestingly, when the skeletal muscle cells in a muscle organ die off, the muscle organ replaces them with dense connective tissue. But dense connective tissue is not a contractile tissue. It doesn't contract the way muscle cells do. So even replacing the dead skeletal muscle cells with connective tissue doesn't maintain the muscle strength. The muscle still gets weaker because it's losing muscle cells. So yeah, we all have to face the fact that we're going to get weaker as we get older. But that being said, part of the loss of strength, part of the weakness that seniors experience is because they stop doing an exercise routine. So I'm saying you're definitely going to get weaker as you get older, but if you have a exercise routine and you conscientiously stick to it throughout your life, that will minimize the amount of strength loss that you have as you get into your senior years. All right, we're going to finish off now talking about degenerative muscle disorders, basically diseases of the muscular system. One disease you may have heard of is called Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or sometimes people just call it muscular dystrophy. It is a fatal degenerative muscle disease, and it shows up in children. It doesn't come along later on in life. If it's going to affect somebody, it shows up even when they're in their childhood years. It tends to show up more in males than females because of the way the genetics of the disease works. And they know what causes it in terms of the proteins of the skeletal muscle cells. Children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy are missing one of the proteins from inside their skeletal muscle cells. They just don't have the gene to make one particular protein. And this protein that they are missing is a protein that holds the actin protein filaments in place. It's not the Z-disc protein, but it's a different protein that also holds the actin filaments. And yeah, so these kids are born without this particular protein, so their actins are not properly held in place, and that causes slow death of the muscle tissue. And so yeah, there is no cure for the disease, and it's fatal. Even with the best medical treatment, these kids that have Duchenne muscular dystrophy don't generally survive past their mid-20s. Another disease of the muscular system is called myasthenia gravis, and this disease is caused not by death of the muscle cells, but by the immune system attacking the receptors for the acetylcholine neurotransmitter that stimulates the muscle cells. So there's a family of diseases called autoimmune diseases where the body's immune system gets confused and starts attacking the body's own proteins and tissues and organs. So if the autoimmune disease myasthenia gravis is this, the immune system gets confused and starts attacking the acetylcholine receptors in skeletal muscle tissues. And they don't know why the immune system gets confused in some people and does this, but it does in some people. Yeah, so their immune system basically kills off the acetylcholine receptors in skeletal muscle cells. And remember, those acetylcholine receptors are what allow the skeletal muscle cell to contract, when it binds the acetylcholine neurotransmitters from the motor neuron. Well, yeah, so as those acetylcholine receptors are wiped out by the immune system, the person can no longer properly contract their voluntary muscles, their skeletal muscles. And interestingly, the effects of this myasthenia gravis first show up in the facial muscles. The person notices that they're getting a sort of partial paralysis of their face, like this person's trying to smile, and you can see some of the muscles here in making this part of the muscles around the mouth contract and smile are just not working. And you might notice sort of a drooping of the eyelids here. Same thing there, that the muscles that cause our eyelids to be more up are getting affected by the myasthenia gravis, and so the person can no longer contract those muscles and keep their eyelids up. Now, so this myasthenia gravis disease, it is treatable. Unlike Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they have some drugs that that can treat the disease. So the people who have this disease don't necessarily die at a younger age than average people do, as long as they're getting the treatments. Okay, well, that about wraps it up for this lecture on the muscular system. As usual, I highly recommend that you now do the review question packet on the muscular system, and I will see you in the next lecture.